doesn't exist. At least, not its origin story. Between fact and fiction, it errs towards the latter. Welcome back, dear listener, to another collection of tales surrounding ancient Rome. Many people accredit Romulus and Remus for finding Rome. The two were born between a Vestal virgin, Rhea, and Mars, the god of war. To claim pregnancy via godly means was, well, skeptical at best. Their mother wasn't meant for children. I mean, the name Vestal Virgin implies something that is on the nose, but what do I know? Rhea left her children by the Tiber River to die, but through divine intervention or fantastical storytelling, this was not their end. Mars, their godly father, sent two of his familiars, a she-wolf and woodpecker, to raise them into good health. They were nurtured by the two until a shepherd discovered the feral boys and fostered them as his own. Over time, they learned of their true nature. Their mother was the daughter of King Numitor, who laid claim on the land until his brother Romulus usurped him. Fearful of any challenge to his throne, Romulus forced Rhea to chastity by becoming a Vestal virgin. The boys saw this as their call to action and took up arms against their great uncle. They won. This victory was cut short, for a quarrel between the two brothers had occurred. Who would lead the people now? "Certainly I," said Romulus. "No, most definitely me," retorted Remus. This ended with Remus dead and Rome being founded on the Palatine Hill by the Tiber, where the two had been saved as babies years prior. Now, did this actually happen? In all likelihood, probably not. Lupa in Latin can translate to she-wolf or prostitute, and indicated the supposed twins were of a less than noble background. To be raised by wolves is a common idiom to point out someone particularly uncouth, an idea that wasn't lost on the Romans. It's naive to believe two orphan boys were the son of a great king, much less demigod kin. Titus Livy is one of the more well-known Roman historians, and even his accounts note that Romulus's mother merely claimed that her twins were the sons of Mars, and suggests it was a ruse to cover up an illicit affair. Even in his preface for A History of Rome, he states, "Such traditions as belong to the time before the city was founded, and are rather adorned with poetic legends than based upon trustworthy historical proofs, I purpose neither to affirm nor refute. It is the privilege of antiquity to mingle divine things with human, and so to add dignity to the beginnings of cities." The etymology of Romulus also implies he wasn't a real person. While in a present-day context, I signifies a man's origin, like in Romani, Iulus was the archaic suffix used. Romulus could very well just mean man from Rome, and not be the name of the man himself. Tell me, does that not sound silly? Was the United States of America founded by a Mr. America? Close. It was named after Amerigo Vespucci, but I digress. When history as ancient as this is recalled in present times, it's easier to attest the victories of the many to the few. Who founded Rome? Romulus. Who was the first king? Romulus. Need I go on? Still, while the myths retell an inaccurate founding of Rome, it is seldom a boring story. And it's not like the Romans themselves believed these myths. It was just that, a myth. Educated Romans freely saw Romulus as an allegory, not unlike Brecon tales, and endorsed the simple reason that these myths were central to the literary canon of Rome. Romulus and Remus, reduced to myth, but could never be relegated to oblivion. We find ourselves with the question that comes to every rising young man. How do I approach women? You see, when Romulus founded Rome, he welcomed it to any and all, a town that would extend its hospitality to any and everyone. The caveat is that this attracted a colorful sort. Scoundrels, cutthroats, and every ilk of bad blood found themselves in Rome. To be fair, what would attract any do-gooder here? The Etruscans to the north already had an established and wealthy settlement, and Greece in the south was a cultural hub for travelers and tourists. Rome had a lot of competition, and was doing abysmally in comparison to its neighbors. In the early stages, there were no women. It was a dude fest, the equivalent of a middle school boys' locker room. Romulus had to MacGyver a way to bring women to his settlement, and brute force would not suffice. You see, he devised a scheme. Romulus hosted a festival for Neptune, the god of the sea, and invited their Sabine neighbors. Previous diplomatic encounters proved less than fruitful, so an act of good faith was needed. Or so the Romans had them believe. This scheme was so cartoonishly wicked that it made my milk curdle, dear listener. It was simple. Get the Sabines drunk, and when they're too inebriated, we abduct the women and boot the rest of them out. Bingo bango, that was it. The Romans waited for their king to give the signal, and with a swift gesture of his cloak, they sprung their attack. And it worked. Romulus, the mad lad, had done it. In a frenzy, the Romans descended on their drunken neighbors. Obviously, the Sabine women were not too pleased by their predicament, but the Romans were rather persuasive. Their reasoning was that they'd take extra care of their new wives because they feel so guilty of what had occurred. We could argue that this is a class example of Lima syndrome. The captors are now sympathizing with their victims, acting as if they had not just taken these virgin women away from their homes and loved ones and forced them into this new life. The aftermath of the Sabine festival was a delicate situation for Rome. They now had Sabine women as their wives, and the Sabine men, their previous neighbors, were not pleased. War was imminent, and both sides were prepared for a violent clash. The Sabines marched into Roman territory, led by their king Titus Tatius. In an act of treason, Tarpeia, daughter of Roman governor Spurius Tarpeius, opened the city gates for the Sabines. She did this in return for what they bore on their arms, thinking it be gold. But alas, in a cruel irony, Tarpeia was the first to die, being crushed by the Sabine shields and thrown from a rock. The two sides fought. The Sabine women, who were caught in the middle, had a different plan. They had grown attached to their Roman husbands and didn't want to see their families at war. Ercilia, a Sabine woman and wife of Romulus, was able to nurture a peace treaty. The two sides brokered a peace and decided to merge their two cities together. Romulus and Titus were co-rulers of the Roman Sabine kingdoms, until Titus met an untimely death 5 years later, leaving Romulus to rule all on his lonesome. Now then, did this event really take place? Well, depending on who you ask, it depends. Scholars such as Livy, Dionysius, and Cicero all say yes, this did happen. The reasonings, however, differed. According to Livy, The Roman motivation for abducting the Sabine women were solely to increase the population and claimed no form of assault, be it sexual or otherwise. Romulus declared that it was all owing to the pride of their parents in denying the right of intermarriage to their neighbors. They would live in honorable wedlock and share all their property and civil rights, and, dearest of all to human nature, would be the mothers of free men. Cicero agreed with Livy, stating it was necessary to strengthen the new state, suggesting this event never took place and was mere propaganda to tell tales of Rome's power. After the Samnite War in 4th century BC, this story would have been told to explain the assimilation of Rome's many neighbors, adhering to their military prowess. Coins minted around 89 BC also displayed the Sabine festival in all its glory. Surely a story showcasing Rome's capacity for brutal violence, but ultimately holding back after the submission of the Sabines, would have been a powerful story to tell any and all that would oppose Rome. Whether it is fact or fiction, the same principles apply here like they did with the origins of Rome. These myths were central to the story of Rome, and regardless of its authenticity, could never be forgotten into obscurity. All things come to an end, even to those gifted by the gods. After a reign of 40 years, Romulus was swept up in a whirlwind during a violent storm, never to be seen again. The throne was empty, and the Romans searched far and wide for their king, but couldn't find him. Some say he ascended into godhood. Others suggested he fled the city to start anew. Needless to say that none of this is true. It's more likely that, in typical Roman fashion, he was assassinated by his senators so they could elect a new king. That is, assuming he existed at all. But then again, most of early Roman history is more myth than reality. Imagine a life where being a cabbage farmer was enough to meet your needs. It seems like a far-fetched dream, but a long time ago, in an empire far, far away, this wasn't the case. Rome was a prosperous place where merchants, soldiers, and peasants could live off their trade. But how much do we know about their day-to-day? What really went on? I'm glad you asked, dear listener. Describing the occupations of an average Roman citizen is challenging due to the limited demography of their population. The surviving historical records represent only a small fraction of what the Romans left behind, offering a somewhat skewed perspective on their society. The existing letters and books have been preserved primarily through the efforts of various monks, philosophers, and Arabian scholars, but these documents tend to focus more on storytelling and anecdotes rather than raw analytical data. Mind you, it's essential to recognize the inherent bias in these texts. Unlike today, finding the opinion of your average Joe isn't as easy as looking up their social media or doing a quick Google search. First-hand accounts from the likes of slaves and commoners are seldom seen, much less preserved. A majority of our sources come from prominent figures like Seneca and Galen, who belonged to the aristocracy. Historians are trained to read between the lines, yet the lack of comprehensive data poses a significant obstacle, as we cannot travel back in time to gather more information. Within these passages, there are references to certain professions, often mentioned in the context of complaints. These include armpit pluckers, masseuses, confectioners, cake sellers, sausage makers, food vendors, carriage drivers, litter bearers, saw sharpeners, and aspiring musicians. It's important to consider the role of slaves in these professions, seeing as they made up a substantial portion of the population. Slaves performed a wide range of jobs, from menial tasks to what we consider white collar. Making up the backbone of Roman society, they could be assigned to virtually any job imaginable. This, of course, led to a hierarchy among the slaves. Not all were created equal. The vicari were the slaves that held power over other slaves. These people were often well educated, coming from Grecian settlements, and could read and write. Within a wealthy household, the vicari acted as the second hand of the master, managing and looking over all the other slaves within the home. Some slaves, like the imperial secretaries, even commanded more respect than many freeborn citizens. The construction of the Colosseum itself was completed by slaves working under the guidance of foremen, who were likely also slaves. These foremen received instructions from architects about whom we have limited information, but it's likely they could have all been slaves as well. See what I'm getting at? Who runs the world? Slaves. Well, not really, but for the upper middle class and onwards, slaves could do the work for you if you could afford it. The prevalence of slaves in a specific profession depended on the financial capacity of individuals in that field. While emperors had seemingly limitless resources to command grand projects that required thousands of workers, common citizens, such as bakers or dyers, might not have had the means to afford slaves for their work. Apologies. It seems I've gone on a tangent yet again. If I had to pick a stereotypical job, it'd most definitely be either construction or farming. construction because rich people loved building things. Well, they still do. And slaves were more expensive than free labor. Oftentimes, an unskilled worker could pick up a trade and learn it with hands-on experience at the cost of no guaranteed wages. This policy also stemmed into farming, because how else are the people of Rome going to eat? For reference, the Roman Empire had a population of 45 million and spanned over 2 million square miles across Europe during the reign of Emperor Augustus. That's a whole lot of mouths to feed. So, let's say you got a construction job working on the Aqua Tepula or as a silk merchant with imported goods from China. Congratulations. Oh, you're wondering what the traffic was like. Is it as abysmal as traversing a city with modern-day traffic? Perhaps. The decree against large carts on the street during specific hours certainly implies this. In the roads which are or shall be within the city of Rome, or within the limit of continuous habitation, no person, after the first day of January next following, shall be allowed in the daytime, after sunrise or before the 10th hour of the day, to lead or drive any heavy wagon, except where it shall be requisite, for the sake of building the sacred temples of the immortal gods, or carrying out some public work, to draw or convey material into the city, or where, in pursuance of a contract for the demolition of buildings, it shall be requisite for public ends to carry the material out of the city, or away from such places, and in cases and for objects for the which it shall be lawful, for specified persons and for specified causes, to lead or drive wagons. On all days when the Vestal Virgins, the Rex Sacrorum, and the Flamens shall be required to ride in wagons in the city for the sake of the public sacrifices of the Roman people, or when wagons shall be required for a triumphal procession on the day fixed for such triumph, or for games which shall be publicly celebrated within the city of Rome, or within 1 mile of the city, or for the procession at the Ludi, Circenses, for all such causes, and on all such days, it shall be lawful for wagons to be led or driven in the city in the daytime, notwithstanding any enactments in this law. It shall be lawful for wagons, brought into the city by night, drawn by oxen or horses, if returning empty or conveying away refuse, to be in the city of Rome, or within 1 mile of the city after sunrise, in the first 10 hours of the day, notwithstanding any enactments in this law. Pretty standard legalese here. Don't have your carts out during the day or special events, and keep everything tidy, yada yada. On paper, none of this sounds bad until you realize just how wretched the infrastructure was. You see, Rome was not as well built as cities like Alexandria or New York, which were built on a grid. No, dear listener, it was a glorious mess. Roadblocks were put out to keep wagons on designated roads. There were also gates placed within the cities that each merchant had to go through before getting into the city. These gates were a bottleneck for traffic, reminiscent of waiting in line at airport security or paying a toll on the highway. Picture this. You're a hypothetical merchant. Your day would start at the break of dawn as you journey toward one of the city gates. You wait in a terribly long and cramped line as Roman guards check your wares and charge you a toll before entering the city. You never liked the guards. They'd always poke fun at you. Oh, you're a cabbage farmer, as if anyone cares about your cabbages. They laugh in your face and charge you the aureus equivalent of a day's work. You shrug it off. Once you enter the city, the poor infrastructure and unkempt cobblestone streets make it hard for your wagon and horse to navigate. One of your wheels has cracked from the cobblestone. Cripes. Your horse is looking a little displeased as well. It seems like the local delinquents are causing a ruckus again, throwing stone at passers-by and making awfully coarse comments about your hair. Oh, apologies. It seems I've gotten carried away again. The point is that it was grueling work to get into the city. Roman historian Livy puts it as such. The proposed measure for migration was dropped, and they began to rebuild the city in a haphazard way. Tiling was provided at the public expense. Everyone was given the right to cut stone and timber where he pleased, after giving security that the building should be completed within the year. In their haste, they took no trouble to plan out straight streets. As all distinction of ownership in the soil were lost, they built on any ground that happened to be vacant. That is the reason why the old sewers, which originally were carried under public ground, now run everywhere under private houses, and why the conformation of the city resembles one casually built upon by settlers, rather than one regularly planned out. Rome was built by the Tiber, which was difficult to work with. The rolling hills and twisting river didn't help in the back-end construction of sewage systems, waterways, and building foundations. With a high population density and low space, you get the sense that early Rome was a very cramped city. It was not uncommon for wagon drivers to hire thugs to accompany them during their journey to the marketplaces, hurling insults and shoving people to move out of oncoming traffic. Was this legal? Actually, yes. At the time, there were no traffic regulations that we know of, so any and all means of transportation shortcuts were used with varying effectiveness.